Brighton Women's Centre has been going for almost 50 years. We support women with a number of matters. We also offer peer-to-peer support. There is a food bank available. We also offer therapy services, and there is also an on-site creche. This is not an exhaustive list of what is available, but gives you a snapshot of what Brighton Women's Centre has to offer.
Brighton Women's Centre means so much to me. I started volunteering here about 6 or 7 years ago, I think. And I've only just started working here properly since December. It's the first place I've worked that I felt fully supported. I feel incredibly inspired by all the women around me. They're just inspiring, smart, powerful, everything I wish to be.
A place where there's support and where women can get to believe in themselves and gain strength.
Brighton Women's Centre means to me support, care and creativity.
International Women's Day is where we get to celebrate all our achievements, or at least some of them, but also to notice how far we still have to go.
Connection, debate and fun.
It means a lot to, uplift anyone who identifies as female, and also push for conversation about things that may be uncomfortable but are really important for our rights in the future.
And what would you choose to challenge?
Poverty and inequality in education.
I would choose to challenge the idea that a woman should not be paid the same amount of money as a man for doing exactly the same job.
I challenge as women, our uncertainty and lack of confidence in ourselves, not believing how much we can really do.
I think I'd challenge the way that consent is taught. I think it should be taught at a really young age. I think by doing so it can eradicate a lot of myths around sexual violence, and I think it's even just really important for kids to know the names for parts of their bodies and understand that they have the right to take control of their body and not allow others to push them to do anything they don't wish for.
Hello everybody and welcome to this our Brighton Women's Centre International Women's Day panel discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on women, hosted by Brighton Dome. For those of you that know Brighton Women's Centre and how important it is for us to celebrate our International Women's Day events at Brighton Dome and Brighton Museums, you can see that this year it's all looking rather different. And as a result of the impact of the pandemic and the continued national restrictions, we're hosting our event on live, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here with us today. So, unsurprisingly, the topic for the panel discussion is the impact of the coronavirus on women, and I've got some amazing panelists alongside me this morning. I'm just going to briefly welcome them, and then I will go on to introduce each of them to you individually before they speak. So this morning we've got with us Harriet Braithwaite, Stephenson, Anita Johal, and Mandu Reid. So how we're going to run this morning's event is that each of our illustrious panelists are going to speak with you for about 5 minutes on a topic of their expertise and knowledge. And then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation amongst ourselves on the panel. And we're also then going to invite you to pose some questions to the panelists. So you will see on your screen that there is a question and answer box. You're enthusiastically urged to put your questions into the question and answer box, and do say if you do not want to come up onto the screen and ask your question in the box when you pose your question, because you will be invited to come on the screen and ask your question yourself if you would like to. Throughout the event, we're going to be asking a few questions of you in the audience. So we will be running a few polls. And this is what we're going to start with now. So we're going to ask you the first question, and there will be a poll that comes up on the screen. If you could make your choice and then press the submit button, and we can see how you're all feeling at the moment about question 1. Thank you. Okay, it looks like we've got a very large percentage of the audience who think that COVID-19 is having a disproportionate effect on women. I think, panelists, you're not going to have a very hard job this morning by the looks of this, convincing our audience of the impact of the virus. So it looks like it's going to be quite an easy job for you. So we will move into the first speaker, and I'd very much like to introduce you all to Harriet Braithwaite. Harriet is a social researcher with a special interest in women and policy making. I'm delighted to say that Harriet joined Brighton Women's Centre last year and volunteered with us and undertook her research on the impact of COVID-19 on Brighton Women's Centre and our service users. And so, of course, we wouldn't we, invite her to speak on that subject matter this morning. So, Harriet, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks for the introduction. So I just want to talk a little bit about the research that I did last summer. So I worked at Brighton Women's Centre last summer, sort of in an administrative role and just sort of observing the impacts of COVID-19 on service users and BWC as an organisation. And I was sort of specifically interested in this idea that there's a one-size-fits-men approach in a lot of public decision making. Can see Mandu laughing there. So when COVID-19 happened, I sort of wanted to understand how this would impact women who already face disadvantage, and I wanted to understand this in local context. So as was sort of explained on the introduction video, Brighton Women's Centre help women from all types of backgrounds facing all kinds of issues. So it really didn't take long working with Brighton Women's Centre to see the absolute value and necessity in keeping these running. So these services include food bank, therapy, peer-to-peer groups, which includes 50+ groups, support to women who are in contact with the criminal justice system, accommodation support, a nursery, and a newly established telephone helpline, which replaced what was drop-in hubs prior to the pandemic. So I'll just present their impacts in a sort of thematic way, because many of these were common across a lot of the services. So I think quite significantly was the impact on women's mental health. So it was really widely reported by service users that their mental health had deteriorated in the first lockdown. So women were particularly displaying anxiety, depression, paranoia. And I think that lockdown was an isolating time for a lot of people, but where a lot of us fought loneliness by hopping on Zoom calls and speaking to family and friends online. A lot of women were actually quite unhappy to reveal an unhappy environment to the outside world, and that prevented them from actually doing so. And I think that sort of leads you nicely on to consider this idea of digital exclusion. So I think that many of us have relied on IT to get through this pandemic, and without it, we wouldn't be able to have this celebration today. But I think that COVID-19 has really spotlighted this idea of a digital divide. So I think that having a smartphone for many of us is insignificant, it's normal. But for many women that access Brighton Women's Centre, not having that access to that sort of IT meant for at least a period of time, they weren't able to access the support services that they needed. And I think that also revealed challenges in being able to engage remotely. So I think that the pandemic really showed that the digital world is not and cannot replace the value of that face-to-face contact. And I think that service users made the best of a bad situation and demonstrated immense ability to adapt and be proactive in continuing to engage. But for some people, it wasn't an option. And I think that some people really need that human contact to visit a safe space, to feel supported. And I think that, you know, we need to urge to bring that back as soon as we can, safely. So I think that a big result of that was that staff widely reported sort of having safeguarding concerns of the women that they were speaking to. So women were having to leave the house to be able to speak on the phone, the whispering indoors, or like just locking themselves in a room to find an uninterrupted space. So there was definitely challenges there about how fully women were able to access support freely and honestly. And staff, I remember staff saying it was hard to be able to do enough. So as I said, there was a helpline telephone service that was set up to replace the drop-in, and that received quite a high volume of calls throughout the first lockdown. And that was from women looking for support for issues such as domestic violence or coercion from a partner. In other cases, women just needed to talk. They felt trapped in their home responsibilities, whether that was in a care role or financially dependent on a partner, but this sense of entrapment. And I think a further significant issue, I would say, is the housing instability that was sort of revealed. So a number of Brighton Women's Centre's service users face housing instability, and that includes street homelessness as well as temporary local accommodation. So in terms of the issues in COVID-19, there was no women-only accommodation provided initially. So women reported feeling very unsafe in those emergency hostels. They had to tolerate really challenging behaviour, live in close proximity with drugs. And for those who did have temporary housing contracts, local guidance was vague for a really long time. Contracts weren't extended, and in some cases, BWC staff had to fight really hard to advocate for contract extensions for women with special protection measures. And by June, we were seeing eviction notices being issued at large. And I'd be curious to sort of know how that has continued since the end of my research. And I think that the final thing that I would like to note is the issue of food insecurity. So between 2019 and 20, 248 women accessed the food bank service provided by Brighton Women's Centre. So when lockdown was announced, the closure of the food bank was a huge problem for a lot of women. And although staff were really, really quick to refer women to alternative services, reach out and make sure that they were catered for, the helpline service continued to receive calls throughout my research period, continually asking about how they can access food. And I think that really highlights the severity of that issue. So I think that that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the sort of key impacts. Just to say that a similar study was conducted by Advanced Charity, and they're based in London, and that very much mirrored the themes that I've just talked about. So we know that this is not just local and it's happening very much elsewhere. But hopefully that sort of provides a good introduction for what the other panellists will talk about. So I'll hand over.
Thank you, Harriet. That's certainly given us plenty of food for thought. And as I say, for those of you in the audience, do please start putting your questions into the Q&A box. And again, if you don't want to come up on screen and ask that question, do just let us know that so we're aware of if that's the case. So I'd like to now move on to Mary-Ann Stephenson. Mary-Ann has worked for women's equality and human rights for over 20 years as a campaigner, researcher and trainer. She was previously director of the Fawcett Society and a commissioner on the Women's National Commission. She is a founder member of Coventry Women's Voices and a board member of Coventry Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre. She also has a PhD in law from the University of Warwick, and she's currently the director of the Women's Budget Group. So Mary-Ann, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for having me. I was listening to what Harriet said, and it really struck me that, you know, a lot of what we do at the Women's Budget Group is focusing on the numbers and, you know, the percentages of women in different groups, percentages of women who've lost their jobs. And actually, it's those first-hand accounts and the individual stories of women that really bring home what those numbers mean. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how women have been hit harder by COVID, and then talk about the budget and what was in it, or rather what was not in it for women. So to start off with, I mean, it's not going to be a surprise for you. I saw the poll results. 98% of you recognise that women were hit harder than men, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about why. First of all, women are more likely to be responsible for unpaid work. Before COVID, women did 60% more unpaid work than men. So it's not surprising really that when schools and nurseries closed in the first lockdown and then schools in subsequent lockdowns, it was women who did the majority of childcare, and between 50% more and twice as much childcare as men, depending on which survey you look at. Because of the jobs women do, there's a kind of split. So women are overrepresented among key workers. So those who had to carry on working, particularly in frontline roles during the whole of the last year. But also women are overrepresented in those sectors which were locked down in each lockdown, completely closed. So high street retail, hospitality, health and beauty, and so on, which is one of the main reasons why women have been more likely to have been furloughed than men. So in 70% of Westminster constituencies, the majority of those who've been furloughed have been women. And we know that under lockdown, levels of domestic violence and abuse against women soared, and women were more likely to obviously previously more likely to experience violence and abuse in relationships, and that has got worse. So you'd have expected the budget on Wednesday to have recognised this, for the government to actually say, look, we can see women have been hit harder, we need to do something about it. That's not what happened. So there was nothing in the budget, for example, on social care, despite the fact that after decades of underfunding, even before the pandemic, we had 1.5 million people in the UK with unmet care needs, and an army of unpaid carers making up for gaps in social care provision. And COVID has made that worse. Social care is in a really dire situation, partly because of large numbers of vacancies now, because not surprisingly, anybody who can keep themselves or a loved one out of residential care during a pandemic, which has hit people in residential care so hard, will do so. But the way in which a sector is structured is so precarious that those empty beds mean social care providers are in danger of closing. Similarly, there was absolutely nothing in the budget on childcare, despite the fact that 58% of local authorities have said that they expect to see childcare closures in the next year. And again, the way the childcare sector is underfunded and structured means that it's very vulnerable at the moment, particularly to vacancies. So the money that the government provides for the free hours that nurseries provide isn't sufficient to cover the cost of those hours, which means that nurseries have to cross-subsidise from people with paid for hours. And that means particularly in poorer areas where people are less likely to pay for additional hours, nurseries can struggle to survive. But the Chancellor said nothing on childcare, despite its importance as a vital form of social infrastructure. The furlough scheme was extended, which is a good thing, and we have to recognise that furlough has prevented widespread job losses over the last year, although there have been job losses, partly because the government has often not extended furlough till the last possible minute. But there was nothing in the furlough scheme to retrain workers. So we've got a lot of people at the moment on furlough who have been working in sectors where there are likely to be job losses as soon as furlough scheme ends. You know, the government needs to recognise that now and actually offer training to people who have been furloughed in order that they can get new jobs in different sectors. And just as the furlough scheme comes to an end, the uplift in universal credit, which was extended for another 6 months, is also going to come to an end. So we're in this slightly odd situation where on the one hand, the government is admitting that universal credit is not enough to live on because they've increased it by £20 a week, but they're refusing to make that increase permanent because somehow at some point when unemployment is at its height in 6 months' time, it's all right to cut people's universal credit payments by £20 a week. And that extension did nothing for the people who are on what's called legacy benefits. These are the benefits that existed before universal credit that a lot of people, particularly disabled people, are still on. They haven't seen an uplift. There hasn't been an uplift in what's called contributory benefits. So these are benefits that you get because you've paid national insurance contributions and they're not means tested. Which means that if you have a partner who's still working, they can provide you with some income for 6 months. No uplift there. The biggest boost to the economy in the budget was through this what's called a super deduction, which is 130% tax allowance for companies investing in physical plant, machinery, equipment, cars, and so on. There's no equivalent support for people investing in training, for example, despite the fact that we need to retrain people. And the way that scheme works, we could end up in a situation where a company like Amazon, which has made huge profits in the last year, could end up with no tax liability at all, which I doubt very much is the government's intention. It's a very badly targeted boost. And we've also seen hidden away in the detail of the budget, though not in the Chancellor's speech, further cuts to departmental spending. So all in all, the budget's been a bit of a disaster for women. We've been calling for the government to invest in a care-led recovery. Our research has shown that if you invested the same amount of money in care as you did in construction, you could create 2.7 times as many jobs. 10% more jobs for women and over 6 times as many jobs, 10% more jobs for men and over 6 times as many jobs for women. So rather than build, which has been the government's mantra for recovery, we think the focus should be on care. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. A really fantastic overview, and certainly can relate to a couple of those sort of themes that you picked up there, certainly around the childcare element, which has clearly been a major issue for us at BWC, and the provision of our toy box preschool, which I'm sure we can sort of come on to talk a bit more about in the conversation, and also the furloughing scheme. Having a daughter myself who was on long-term furlough and has recently been made redundant, I can really relate to some of those issues as well. So all really important factors. Can I move on now then, please, to introduce you all to Anita Johal. Anita is the Black and Minoritised Communities Domestic Abuse Worker within the Big Lottery Communities Project at Rise in Brighton. The aim is to work in a needs-led, strength-based way to build trust with communities and create safe spaces for Black and minoritised women. Intersectional advocacy and holistic support is key to her casework, and she's previously worked with Southall Black Sisters. So welcome, Anita.
Thank you for having me. I think it's important to start by talking about the sad loss of our contract for some of our work that has gone to victim support and to Stonewater. That means the casework and refuge has gone over to new providers, and it has been difficult, but I think it's really important to send a message out to survivors that there is going to be a service from the new providers, and that Rise will continue to work in ways which will include the helpline, for example, and hopefully the communities work, which is what I'm going to focus on today. There's a survivor-led campaign which has got over 27,000 signatures, and please do go to our website if you want to support that. The impact of COVID-19 on people experiencing domestic abuse, we know it's been catastrophic. I think there have been stats like 700% increase to calls from the for Refuge, the national charity. Domestic killings increasing twofold in the 3 weeks of March 2020. Generally speaking, in terms of Rise, early in the pandemic, we focused in on the helpline. Our energies went towards digital information and support, and we're going to pick up on that based on what Harriet was talking about the tech divide. But the live pickup on our helplines increased threefold, so that's an important thing to recognise. But what I want to focus on today is my work with the Big Lotteries Communities Project. And it's a combination really of communities work and casework in my case. Our approach, as you heard, was it's needs-led and it's strength-based. It's aiming to build relationships with communities, to build trust, so that conversations around domestic abuse can happen. Why is it so important? Because it's usually our communities that hear about domestic abuse first. My area of work is with Black and minoritized communities, and it's important to acknowledge that Rise is a white mainstream organisation. We know there are barriers for these communities in terms of accessing RISE and in terms of accessing other institutions like the police, local authority. Racism, lack of representation, language, immigration issues, to name but a few. To break these barriers down, to build the trust, we have to listen to communities, which is what we've been trying to do. And we've been sort of working with communities in terms of activities that they've told us that they want to do. And we've worked on Sew and Grow, a sewing project, and telling our stories, which is sort of coming together to share stories. Pre-COVID, these were obviously in person, and then we had to think about working in different ways. Because we have built relationships already with these communities, we kind of listened to what would work best for them. Now, Zoom and online's taking over at this point, and yeah, some members of the community are okay with that and using it, but quite a few were not, and obviously this tech divide is highlighted here. With speaking to women, like we talked about what would work best for them, WhatsApp was one way of connecting, and so that's what we used. So we used WhatsApp to continue with these projects. So it looked very different, but we did try to continue in that way. So casework, my work with survivors, my casework referral pathways really through those communities that we've been building trust with. And really the aim is to try and reach people in the margins, who are often invisibilized. I must mention Cora Phipps is the lead specialist Black and Minoritised caseworker at RISE, and her referrals are through professionals and self-referrals. And our casework really, you could say pre-COVID, it's casework plus. There are specific additional needs and barriers that Black and minoritised women face. And, the way we try to work is by practicing intersectional advocacy to try and deal with all these barriers that we talk about. So, for example, out of those communities, Black and minoritised women in RISE, 20% have no recourse to public funds. So post-COVID, at the beginning of the pandemic, the issues we're hearing about are, first of all, actually understanding information around the pandemic. So it's particularly difficult if there are language issues, for example. As I explained, RISE and nationally domestic abuse services went online and by phone, but that's not easily accessible in terms of language or the tech divide that we've been talking about. And importantly, if you don't know who we are, or you don't trust us, or you're not being referred by professionals anymore, because obviously that, that did really change. Then we've got the fact that Black and minoritised communities are disproportionately affected by the virus itself. We know that more are dying, more are in ICU, and the advice is to stay at home. So you can imagine for survivors, much more fearful of leaving their home. It's limiting interaction with anybody face to face, and it means it's really difficult to reach those particular survivors. And then we have the Prime Minister who says you can leave your home if you're a victim of domestic abuse. But for some, the question, people don't realise that they're experiencing domestic abuse, or if you have language issues, you're not understanding that. Also, where do you go if you don't trust the police, for example? So if you're a migrant woman, you might fear deportation, so you may not want to report, and that's been exacerbated by this. For example, going to a health, even going to a hospital, is problematic when we know that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy, for example. Carmen Nirvana have done a report highlighting that although domestic abuse referrals went up, other forms of violence against women and girls referrals went down. So looking at sort of survivors of honour-based abuse, forced marriage and female genital mutilation. Because professionals aren't referring, lots of reasons, because the media is talking about domestic abuse, but not other specific forms of abuse that disproportionately affect these communities. As Harriet was saying, where will people go? There is worry about kind of the type of accommodation. Is it safe? It's far away, drug issues, etc. I'm just going to end by saying that in this pandemic, where everything shut down practically, what was really formidable was the community's response. And, I would say that a more grassroots community-led response to this pandemic, the pandemic of domestic abuse, is really important. And, that's something that we really hope continues in the future with our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. You've really highlighted some very important and crucial aspects of the impact of the pandemic on women in relation to domestic abuse. And I really hope that we can go on to explore that a little bit further in the discussion and Q&A. So thank you for that really comprehensive overview. If I could now come to our fourth and last but by no means least panelist, and before I do that, just again remind you to pop your questions into the Q&A box. Again, if you'd like to come up on screen and ask your question live, then you'd be very welcome to do that, just to encourage a little bit of interaction with us here today. But equally, if you'd rather not, then we will ask the question on your behalf. So I'm going to move on now to Mandu Reid. Mandu is the leader of the UK Women's Equality Party, and she is the first person of colour to lead a national political party in British history. Prior to venturing into politics, she worked as a public servant for over 15 years at the Treasury, the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and for the first 3 mayors of London. In 2019, she was recognised by Apolitical as one of the top 100 most influential people in global gender policy, alongside Michelle Obama, Melinda Gates, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, amongst others. She has stood for election for WEP twice so far and is WEP's candidate for Mayor of London in the May 2021 elections. So welcome, Mandu.
Am I visible? Yes.
You are now.
I believe that I am now. First of all, thank you so much, Lisa and the team at BWC, for holding and hosting this event and for giving me the immense privilege and opportunity to be part of it. Thank you so much to Harriet, Marianne and Anita for setting the scene so clearly, so poignantly and so powerfully. It falls to me now to spell out the political opportunity. In fact, I think it's more of a political imperative in front of us. So in a way, we've said plenty about some of the impacts on women that have happened so far. I'm going to talk a little bit more about an impact that I want to see, and that is mobilization. That is women finding their voices, finding their power, and finding each other to react and respond to this moment that we're in. I mean, you could say that last year was effectively the prologue of this crisis. And the real question is, what do we want the epilogue to be? And a hell of a lot is going to happen before we get to that epilogue. And almost all of it is going to be problematic at best, catastrophic at worst for women. We are still learning about the psychological, social, and economic impacts of the pandemic, which so far has killed 120,000 people and rising. What we do know is that underpinning and exacerbating those impacts is an older virus, a horribly familiar one: inequality. Inequality is the space between the world we currently live in and the world we want to live in. Our calling, sisters, is to close that gap. The Women's Equality Party was founded on the understanding that society routinely and consistently overlooks women, that our media, economic, and political systems are fatally unfair. Our answer is to create the political pressure needed to change those systems, to make them work better for women, and so too for everyone else. COVID has made that project, that objective, way more urgent than it's ever been. But let's just take a step back for a second and let's be real. As an extended family, there will of course be times when we as feminists don't all see eye to eye, times when there's friction, tension, or what feels like competition between people for their rights, freedoms, and priorities. But I passionately believe that even, perhaps especially, when we disagree, the way out of that is dialogue. If we listen to each other and seek to understand, we will find solutions. We will learn from each other and we will forge stronger bonds, bonds that ultimately fortify and energize us, allowing us to focus on what we have in common and how, working together, we can make a difference. The key is never to lose sight of what we're here to do and why. And the speakers who have spoken so far have laid some of that out. Almost every day, though, something happens that reminds me of our purpose. Sometimes it's a small thing. Sometimes it's a painful thing. And for somebody like Anita, for example, working on the front lines, it's probably more often than not a painful thing. Sometimes it's a big political event like the budget this week, which despite everything we learned last year, threw some peanuts at the domestic abuse sector, offered no support or investment, as Marianne has already set out, for our groaning and struggling social and childcare sectors, and delivered what amounts effectively to a real terms pay cut for our nurses. All of those professions, overwhelmingly women are overrepresented in those professions. Black and minority ethnic women, overrepresented too. Other times, I am reminded of our purpose by a breathtaking historical event. Do you remember on the 20th of January, when we finally saw the back of the previous incumbent of the White House? Well, what really stood out for me that day was actually the swearing in of Kamala Harris, the first woman and the first woman of color to occupy the position of US Vice President. You might be wondering, why am I talking about the USA? Well, it'll become clear in a moment. But I mean, I can feel a sort of prickle, on my skin and down my spine as I recall that. I was full of emotion when I watched that ceremony, for all of the obvious reasons, but also because my mind wandered back to the Women's March that had taken place in Washington, D.C. almost exactly 4 years before, the day after Trump's inauguration. It was the largest protest of its kind in US history. And across the world, including here in the UK, over 7 million women marched in solidarity and righteous anger. We, the women of the world, set in motion Trump's unraveling. We were the first to stand up and speak out against him, literally the day after he took office. In January, we saw and got to taste the sweetness of the hard-won and long-awaited fruits of our resistance. Now, I met with a group of Women's Equality Party activists later that evening. It just so happened we were scheduled to get together that night, over Zoom, of course. And I said to them, with the words choking in my throat, that yes, there is still work to do, but let's savor this moment and allow it to teach and reassure us that when women come together, change is possible. We need to conjure that spirit and that energy now. The budget is just one example of why and how the status quo that holds us all back is stubborn as hell and will cling on for dear life. We can take that knowing that change is possible into our next campaigns. In 61 days' time, the country goes to the polls. These elections are about sending a message from the women of the UK and holding those in power to account. But they are also about showing people that a different future is possible. The Prime Minister talks about building back better, but better only for some is not enough. We must build back equal. So we, the Women's Equality Party, will be contesting elections across the country, including, as you've heard, in London, where I'm standing for mayor. Let's face it, I'm an outside bet to be the next mayor of London. But what we're also doing is we're standing for the London Assembly, where we have a real shot of getting somebody elected due to the different electoral systems. So small parties always have a chance. I know that I'm speaking to a Brighton audience, but progress is incremental. For us to get a foothold on an institution like that, holding one of the most powerful politicians in the country to account on behalf of women and girls everywhere, is a big deal. It's not just a big deal for the 4.5 million women of London. So it is time for women to raise our voices again. It is time for us to tell our stories, to speak up for ourselves and for one another. Because when women are the storytellers, the human story changes. And when women are the story makers, history itself changes. So our work right now is about starting to write the story that will end with the epilogue we want those coming after us to read. All the ingredients is there. The previous speakers have set it out. So thank you so much for lending me your ears and your attention. And I really look forward, this is the best bit now, for the conversation that awaits us over the next hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandu. You're rather a hard act to follow. Your passion and enthusiasm is absolutely infectious. And it's amazing to hear that that passion for the continued solidarity between women can end up in some amazing outcomes, as long as we can continue to find the strength to fight the inequalities that we still face in our societies. So before we move into a bit of a conversation between the panelists, I would like to just run the first poll again for everybody, and it'll be interesting to see what happens here, because clearly a lot of members of the audience felt quite strongly that coronavirus has had a strongly disproportionate impact on women, but maybe some of you have decided after hearing from everybody that it hasn't. Who knows? So let's run the poll a second time and see. Okay, so interesting. We still have 2% of the audience who remain certain that it isn't having a disproportionate impact, and the same amount who believe that it is. So what do we make of that, my fellow panelists? Anybody brave enough to put forward a view, and of course raise anything that you would like to from what we've heard from each of you this morning so far?
I think sometimes there is an assumption that if you're saying something like COVID has hit women harder, you're saying that men haven't suffered, and that's not the case. So some people might sort of tick the no box because they're thinking that what this represents is a sort of assumption that men have had it easy over the past year. You know, lots of people have had a really, really tough year. And there's been particular impacts on people on the basis of class and race and disability, as well as between women and men. So, and those obviously all intersect. So I think, you know, saying that there's been particular impacts on women because of the combination of unpaid work and the sort of paid roles that women are in, doesn't mean that there hasn't been, you know, particular impact, for example, on Black or Asian men, on men who are working in frontline roles, it just means that overall, as a group, women have been hit harder than men. And I think that's sometimes why people get a bit wary about voting for that in those sorts of polls. That would be my assumption.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think this isn't hypothesis. The data that's there when you try and examine society, let's just put COVID aside for a second. When you examine society from the point of view of what people's lives are like, women are, never mind COVID for a second, women are disproportionately more likely to be on 0 hours contracts, living in poverty, working in very low paid or precarious employment. And then you overlay the kind of way COVID has exerted itself, let's put it that way, on society. And of course, people who are vulnerable from the perspective of their economic circumstances have, of course, endured more suffering, more challenge, potentially been at greater risk from contracting the virus itself. And so this isn't like an ideological thing. This is just what the information that's available to us tells us. It's the story that it tells. I wish it told a different story, but we got to face up to the reality that's in front of us. And if this country wants to bounce back, what are we saying? We're going to level up and build back better or whatever it is. If you really want to do that, you need to look at how support for women would actually serve the goals you have around reinvigorating our economy. But the blindness we have to that is going to do a damage, not us. The blindness our government has to that is going to damage the economy in ways that, we'll be feeling for a long time to come if we're not careful.
And I just add as well, in terms of domestic abuse, absolutely it does affect men. But it is a gendered crime. And again, it's, data to support that. 91% of domestic violent crime that causes injuries are against women. Women are much more likely to be seriously hurt or killed than male victims of domestic abuse. So, that kind of has what the pandemic has done is exacerbated everything that's already been there in terms of inequalities. And I just wanted to mention that in terms of the work that we do. But it does obviously affect all communities.
Absolutely, thank you. Harriet, is there anything that you would like to reflect on based on the audience response to the polls, or in relation to what you've heard other people speak about this morning?
Yeah, I think that the thing that I would like to raise, just sort of as Mandu was sort of hinting at there about this idea that the government is blind, I think that it's just to raise it, it's really concerning because there are 2 examples within the last 10 years of this happening elsewhere in the world where we know that public health emergencies do impact women more acutely. And those are the Ebola virus and the Zika virus, which we've all heard of. So with Ebola, which I think was 2014 to 16, in Sierra Leone, we know that sort of data on that described a second epidemic of violence against women and girls, but also by the end of that period in Sierra Leone, the amount of women that were dying, but because of maternal related deaths and neonatal deaths, actually reached the same number of Ebola related deaths. And with the Zika virus in Brazil, the handling of that was that there was so much focus on how the virus impacted women in terms of birth defects and pregnancy complications, that the whole public narrative of Zika focused on women, but focused on controlling them and their bodies as these vectors of this virus. And I think that we saw like huge social pressures there. So I just think within the last 10 years, we've got these 2 examples of how women are just put to sort of the second tier. And I think it's concerning that we weren't prepared for this better.
Well, I mean, it's worse than that. I mean, Mandu and I were on a panel with Claire Wenhan from the LSE, who's worked on both of those pandemics. And one of the things that she said was that she'd actually raised this with the government and actually said, look, this is the evidence. You might not be aware of it. This is what the evidence shows. And their response was, London is not Liberia. And this won't happen here. And I think there's a sort of, there's some sort of assumption that I don't know whether it's English exceptionalism or something, that all these effects that we can see in other situations somehow won't affect us. And they were warned.
Yeah, and I think.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Harriet.
As Anita was saying, it did happen. Within the first 3 weeks, the number of women being killed by men in a domestic situation doubled, and it was the highest it's been for 10 years in that same 3-week period.
And can I flag something which probably sounds a little doom and gloom, but it's not doom and gloom if we do something about it, right? A couple of you spoke about digital exclusion as being one of the things that you noticed through the last year as being a problem, and needed careful handling and management. Now, we're about to head into some elections. Like I said, they're 61 days away. And a lot of the electioneering, the campaigning, voting itself is going to rely on people having online access. Now, this is a fact as well. It's a material fact. 58% of those who are digitally excluded, guess what? They're women, right? And a significantly high proportion of those are people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, as well as older people and disabled people too. And so when I look at all of this together in the round, it makes me feel that what's going on is a situation where our government has rolled the dice and they are counting on people from certain backgrounds whose interests have not been served by the work that they've done to stay out of political discourse, to stay detached and separate from it. Because the data gives them a clue that they're probably more likely to be in the context of a campaign that's dominated by digital electioneering. And so in a way, I think that really increases the imperative for all of us who have networks within communities, women's sector mobilization, to make sure people register to vote, to make sure people have a basic understanding of the issues and use their voice. Because if we don't do that, the government will take advantage of the fact that some of the people who have been worst affected by this crisis are the least politically engaged. And so these things all loop back in together. And that's why events like this are so important, because having the vocabulary, first of all, to be able to describe the economic impacts and all the different ways people are affected, whether you like it or not, whether you're directly affected or not, is step one.
I think what you're saying, Mandu, is absolutely crucial. I mean, I was just reflecting on the BWC response. I'm going to take chair's prerogative here just to throw something in, although I probably shouldn't, but hey ho. I can't tell you the amount of IT devices we purchased for the women and families that we work with at BWC. I mean, fortunately, one of the things which was a positive for us as an organisation over the last year was that despite the challenges of trying to transform all of our service into remote and online support, we were able to benefit from a certain amount of grant funding in order to deal with the crisis, which was very pleasing to see, although often they were quite small amounts of money, and it was very stressful and difficult for us to be constantly making small applications for multiple pots of funds. But what it did enable us to do was to buy an awful lot of mobile phones, iPads, laptops, and actually businesses supporting us by making donations of those kinds of devices too, which, without which it would have been impossible to reach the women that you're mentioning in terms of access to that kind of resource to be able to engage with the support that they so badly needed. So it was something that we spent a lot of time having to work on right in the early stages of the pandemic, and still continues to be the case.
It's happening everywhere.
I'm just mindful of time, although we have given ourselves a reasonable amount of time this morning. It's already coming up to 12:30, and I would like to open the discussion out to the audience, if you're all okay with us doing that, unless you had any other sort of last thoughts that you wanted to raise before we do so. Should we take a look at the question and answer box? I can see that we've got a question from Lucy Hadfield. Lucy, I can see that you also would prefer not to come on to the screen, which is absolutely fine. You've put forward a really sort of good overview, but I'm just going to go to the last two sentences, if I may, just to try and keep this fairly succinct, because I do want to try and get the questions in. It looks like, Harriet, this might be a question for you and maybe for me, but I'm going to let you lead on it because I think I've said enough. So virtual spaces like Zoom were seen by our researchers. This is from Anita, Lucy, a research officer at RISE, as a safe and supportive and trauma-informed space. In your research, Harriet, did you come across any examples of this at BWC?
I think that the best example here would be our peer-to-peer groups. So they continue to run remotely via Zoom. As far as I'm aware, they worked really well. But I just think that the feedback sort of throughout was, it's just hard to get social cues and get that same sort of value from social connection, when you're sort of just staring at a screen. So I know that there was a lot of sort of, when do you think we'll be able to meet in person again? So yes, and the staff worked really hard as well to make sure that it could be sort of a safe and supportive space. But just as I sort of said in my initial presentation, we mostly found it just can't replace the value of face-to-face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would endorse that. And I think, as you say, an ongoing desire, completely understandably, for those women to be able to meet up again in face-to-face physical spaces. And some of that we were able to facilitate through outdoor meetups when that was appropriate and allowable through the restrictions. And also, I think, a concern for staff to be working in that way as well. I mean, obviously, we can all do the sort of hide your background, but actually the staff to be working in their own homes and supporting women with some very complex issues and, safeguarding and potential for things to be happening in the background of that woman's home while she's on screen is really very demanding and a big ask of staff. So I think we've been very cautious about how and when we use Zoom as a space, and we've spent a lot of time prioritizing telephone support and regular daily check-ins with those more vulnerable clients, just because we felt that sometimes Zoom isn't the most safest and effective way, although it's clearly been an amazing resource for staff to come together and look after each other. Okay, so who else have we got? I think we've got a question here, Mandu, for you.
Mm-hmm.
AJ, are you happy to come on screen and answer and ask your question? I don't know whether AJ's willing to come on screen. So, oh, here, wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Fantastic. Thank you, AJ, for joining us. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been so interesting hearing from everybody. And hey, Anita. So yeah, I can't see my question anymore, but I think it's around, for Mandu, about politics and the temperature being very high at the moment, kind of on Twitter and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering if that's reality in society, because it does feel like there's some wonderful stuff going on and communities are getting together. But the other thing was, like, what's the one thing that we could do as individuals if we're interested in politics to kind of, I guess, lobby the government in terms of the impact that this has had on women?
Sure. There's so much work to do in that regard that, I can answer this question from lots of different vantage points. But let me start with what you've said about Twitter. Twitter is definitely not the world. Thank goodness, because otherwise, I'm not going to lie to you, I would feel fairly despondent about almost everything if I took Twitter as a true barometer for what's really going on in the world. I mean, one of the issues with a platform like Twitter is you can say what you like without any accountability whatsoever. And it's not a place that lends itself to, productive conversation happening about almost any subject. So it's useful to kind of I mean, I have to, for my job, keep an eye on what's going on there, but I also, partly for my sanity, but also to be as effective as possible, always remind myself that that is a strange parallel universe that doesn't necessarily reflect anything that happens the minute you leave the Twitter sphere and enter the real world. So that's step one. We got elections coming up in just over 60 days. And one of the things you can do as an individual is make sure you're registered to vote and perhaps commit to get 5 people, whoever they may be, who aren't registered. So you got to sniff them out, right? Find them, track them down, and support them to register. So that's one thing which is really important and will make a difference. And it's something that the government doesn't want you to do. They don't want you to do that. They want a low turnout this election so that it is just the usual suspects who are most likely to reward them for their failures showing up to the poll. Another thing you can do if you kind of, you know, an organization like the Brighton's Women's Centre actually has, I think, a really good platform to do something like this, is come together. You know, I spoke about find your voice, find your power, find each other. Come together and organize a hustings for the local candidates who are contesting in this area. Insist that they come and make the whole thing about women. That is your prerogative. You can make it about what you like. Ask them, what are you going to do if you are elected to deal with the fact that XYZ is happening in our communities, for example, in relation to domestic abuse? Force them to have to confront these issues. You can do that, and it makes an enormous difference if and when you do. So those are two like really practical things. You know, the stakes are very high. The margin for error is very small. It sort of feels like sometimes, but little things like that can make a difference in the here and now. And then our work continues anyway, beyond the time frame of these elections, because God knows what the results are going to be. But I think we've seen there's going to be no shortage of things for us to mobilize on, work towards, and demonstrate to this government actually are the wants and desires of 50% of the population. And the last thing I will say is, you've seen the stuff that's happened with the nurses' pay rise, right? Isn't it interesting? Within 24 hours, they're mobilizing. And it looks like we are heading towards one of the first in a very long time strikes by that particular group of people, because they've had enough. But look at the comparison between childcare and social care. They're not organized because they don't have unions representing them. So I point that out to show you how important it is that whatever your kind of like disputes and beef and disagreements might be with, you know, women who are activists on certain issues, we can't allow those to consume us, because we have to come together to fight and shout for the things that won't happen if we don't. Like I say, look at childcare and social care. There's no mobilization, mass mobilization, because there isn't a way for them to come together. Nursing, they're coming together. So it just shows you how important those dynamics are. So reach out, connect, and I hope you don't mind, but you know, you can always join the Women's Equality Party and support our work in a very direct way. I don't mean to be too self-interested, but it is a setup that allows you to do that if you want to do that.
Thank you, Mandu. AJ, thank you for coming on screen and asking your question. Hopefully you feel you've got a fulsome response. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take us on to the next question, and I think this is another one for you, Harriet, by the looks of it. And Monica, it's a question from Monica, who doesn't want to come on screen, which is absolutely fine. And the question is, how much did women with disabilities' use of BWC rise or diminish because of self-shielding after the government removed local authorities' duty of care during the first lockdown? Did your research pick up on this at all, Harriet?
To an extent, yes. I think that the most notable thing in my research was essentially Brighton Women's Centre have one service that is specific to women with disabilities, and that is the musculoskeletal service. So I think that in speaking to the staff that sort of led that, one thing that she said that really stuck with me is that sort of this online world has actually made the world a very accessible place for people who can't always leave the home. So I think that services certainly became more accessible for people who might not be able to travel. So yeah, I think lots of things opened up. In terms of the numbers increasing, I didn't look specifically at that, but I do know that we had long wait lists for certain services. I don't know what they're looking like now, Lisa, but yeah.
Thanks, Harriet. Yeah, we certainly have got long wait lists for example, our therapeutic service. And yeah, completely, agree with what you said, that one of the positives, which we haven't spoke massively about this afternoon now, and maybe we should, is that, of course, as you say, there is a sort of equalizing factor for those women who do find it difficult to kind of come out of their homes into the community and travel to our venues to access support. So actually the benefits of the additional telephone support through helplines and the online platforms that we were able to provide for some of our services has really helped some women feel like they are more able to engage and benefit from the support. So it has had a really positive impact from that perspective. Okay. So the next, oh, sorry, Marianne.
I was just going to say, Lisa, there was a question about a care-led recovery, which I wanted to help by putting in some information about care, but what it meant was that it's moved from opened to answered.
Yes, I did see that, Marianne. Would you like to just say something about that so that we don't miss the opportunity to flag that? I could see that you responded, but let's cover that off now as well.
So this was a question about what does a care-led recovery mean, and I posted in in response a briefing that we've published called a care-led recovery, which people can Google because I can't put it in the chat. But just to summarise, we are calling for a free universal care service, and this is free at the point of use. I mean, with different types of care. So I'll talk first of all about social care and then childcare. So social care, needs to be based on ensuring people's ability to live with dignity and autonomy, whatever their care needs are. Access to it needs to be based on need, not ability to pay, and it needs to be universal. And we need a system that recognises that care work is skilled work. And so that care workers need to be trained properly, paid at a decent level with decent terms and conditions. One of the reasons why COVID spread so quickly in care homes, and there's a number of reasons. I mean, discharging people from hospitals back into care homes was a big one, but also because a lot of care workers are low paid and on insecure contracts, you have care workers working in multiple care homes. And people providing care in people's own homes, moving between lots and lots of different people, and people receiving care in their own homes, having lots and lots of different carers coming in. It's really interesting that in British Columbia, one of the first things in Canada, one of the first things the government did at the beginning of the pandemic was to take care workers into the public sector so that they could be paid decently and so that they could organise people's working shifts so that people weren't travelling across cities to different care homes and providing different care. And we also need support for unpaid carers. We need to recognise that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. So, for example, younger working age disabled people, many of whom currently receive support through individual payments, through direct payments, and are able to buy services themselves, have different care needs for example, somebody who's older with Alzheimer's. And everybody needs to be treated with dignity and autonomy and respect, but how that plays out, what care looks like might vary. So I think we don't want to go for a one-size-fits-all model, but we do need a universal service that's paid for through general taxation centrally and delivered locally. With childcare, I don't understand why we don't have a free universal childcare service. primary schools. We have primary schools in every community. We recognise that children need education. Children also need care. And, you know, childcare is not just a benefit for parents. It's also a huge benefit for children. There's lots of evidence that high quality childcare has positive impacts on child development. And it's a benefit for the rest of us. You know, if I want to go and see my GP, I need to know that she's got childcare so that she can get to work in order to see me if I need to see her. That's why childcare is infrastructure, because it benefits not just those who receive it, but the wider community. The work we've done on childcare shows that a free universal service of high quality with staff paid, you know, at equivalent rates to primary school teachers, recognising that this is, again, skilled work. Most of the costs would be recouped by government through increased taxes and reduced social security claims. So although the system as a whole looks expensive, when you actually look at how much government can get back through reduced costs in other areas, it almost entirely pays for itself. And again, you know, it's infrastructure. We need to recognise this and pay for this.
I'm really pleased, Marianne, that we've got you and the Women's Budget Group advocating for this in such, you know, a strong and important way, because, yeah, I mean, as the director of Brighton Women's Centre, it would be impossible to run a women's service without access to free or very, very low cost childcare. I mean, so many of the women that we support absolutely need to have that facility on, you know, on the premises, so that they know that their children can be safely looked after in order to access the support that they so badly need. And the struggle that we have to resource that facility because of the lack of you know, central funding to support it is, you know, is a real challenge. But, you know, we are committed to providing it because it is crucial to, you know, to the support that women need. I think we've got another question, one here for each of you to take in turn, if that's okay. And maybe through this question, we can pull out perhaps where there may have been some positives over the last year for us. So I think this question is from Monica, and I don't think, Monica, you want to come on the camera, do you? But I can't see whether, that's right, you don't, so that's fine. And what Monica is asking us is, what have you learned from how you've dealt with the pandemic, and what will you be taking forward, either as an individual or as part of your organisation? So, Anita, would it be okay if I came to you first to respond to that question?
Yes. So I think as an organisation, you know, we are in flux at the moment, but obviously, you know, we are looking to work much more in this communities-led way. So I personally am hoping that that can continue because as I was saying earlier, you know, the first really spaces where people talk about domestic abuse is in communities. So I think for me, that's, you know, really been highlighted by the COVID pandemic, when there aren't other structures there to safeguard and support. So there's not access to professionals, you know, that you're not going to maybe the GP or hospital, that young people aren't at school. So those safeguarding measures aren't in place. And so for me, it's the community's work. I think that's really, really important.
Okay, thank you, Anita. And Harriet, how about you?
I think that my sort of key learning would sort of build on what Anita's just said. I think that what really sort of took me aback, especially in the first lockdown, was the amount of people that did come forward in Brighton and say, like, how's your food bank doing? What do you need? How can we help? People starting new businesses saying we want to donate the profits to your charity. I think that there was a lot of community there as well. So I think it's nice to draw out the positives of sort of what this pandemic's revealed as well. And I think just in terms of what I've learned from that and taking that forward, that's just a behaviour that I would like to mirror and take forward in my own life, definitely.
Thank you. And Mandu?
I think one of the things this crisis has done is it's really made the argument loud and clear for how badly we need feminist leadership and the difference it can make. So a lot of discussion has happened about comparisons of countries that have a female head of state who's taken a completely different approach to handling and managing the pandemic. But you don't only have to look at that uber macro level. I can sort of highlight this for you by telling the story of our the first so far elected representative for the Women's Equality Party in the Feminist Republic of Congleton, up in Cheshire East. What she's been able to do is a really, really clear demonstration of the difference it makes having somebody with the right attitude, the right priorities, and the right focus, i.e. a focus on women, around the table. So a pandemic's been unfolding, as you well know, but domestic abuse was front and center in Congleton Council, because our person was in the mix. Her leadership contributed to that. Childcare was not neglected in the same way as it has been in other local authority areas, because of her ability to advocate proudly, loudly, and confidently for the difference it would make in her community. She even got some streets named after women to redress the balance. So there's this whole range of things that are possible when feminist leadership is given a chance, when we have our seat at the table. And one of the things I suppose I've taken away probably links to some of our policies. It basically occurred to me that it might be useful to flip some of our thinking on this. I think we need more barriers to mediocre and incompetent men wielding power. And one of the ways you could do that is have, you know how quotas makes people uncomfortable? I think we need some reverse quotas. I think we need maximum numbers of people from overrepresented groups to be allowed in Parliament, rather than the other way around. You know how they're like, let's get a minimum of X number of women around the table. No, let's have a maximum number of, white middle-aged, middle-class men who've had their chance. They've screwed it all up, and actually now there's a chance we need now to sort of put something different in place that shifts the dial. So I suppose my thinking has flipped around how we frame some of these issues, but one of the really good and heartening things is what we've seen across the world, and we've seen in individual local communities, the difference it makes having women around the table doing all the work we've spent the morning talking about.
Fantastic, thank you, Mandu. And Mary-Ann, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would very much agree with Mandu. I mean, the thing that's really struck me over the last year is, one, I guess, seeing communities come together and seeing, the huge, incredible work done by all sorts of people just to keep services moving. And particularly in the first lockdown, people were saying, oh, the economy is growing as ground to a halt, and you're thinking, but actually stuff is happening. How do we define the economy? Is the economy just about people buying and selling things? Actually, it's not. It's about all of us. It's about the way we organize ourselves, and particularly within that, I was always impressed, but even more than ever, the phenomenal work done by women providing frontline services, like Brighton Women's Centre, but up and down the country. You just see women going, right, okay, this is going to be a bit tough. Well, let's roll up our sleeves and get on with it and just sort it out, find the money, find the ways of doing things, in the most difficult and trying situations, providing support for women in really, really difficult and dangerous situations. And just that kind of roll your sleeves up, practical, get on with it, sort it all out. And I think, I was reflecting on something that Mandu said earlier about Twitter not being life, and how, so much of Twitter is about people tearing each other to pieces. And actually you go out into the real world and what you see is practical feminism in action. Yeah. Just making a difference in women's lives day in, day out, often unsung, often unrecognized, and it, it blows me away. I think it's incredible. I think it's wonderful. And Mandu's also right. You look at all these women and then you think, when people talk about, oh, we can't have quotas because we need to ensure people are in decision-making positions on the basis of merit, and you look at some of those people in those decision-making positions, and then you look at some of these phenomenal women, and you think, there's something going wrong here in your whole merity selection process, really, isn't there? So that's one thing. The other thing that I have learned is that there is a reason why we have schools to educate our children, and that I am not suitable to be a home educator. And I have tried my best, and I am really, really glad that my kids are going back to school next week. So I'm also in awe of teachers as well.
Thanks, Marianne. I think there's probably plenty of us at this event today that will relate to that final comment of yours. And I would just like to say that I think one of the sort of positives from my perspective is that, you know, we women, we know what it's like to live with austerity and inequality. We're living with it every day, and this situation over the last year has just enabled us to up our game and show each other and the world and the politicians, the male-dominated kind of infrastructure that we have in this country, that actually we're not going away. We are going to continue to fight and build the society that we want to see around us. And I think this pandemic has given us an opportunity to do more of that, despite the fact that it is tiring, but somehow we continue to find the energy to keep fighting that fight. And I think that's just incredible to see. Okay, I'm mindful it's 5 to 1, so we're going to be closing up shortly. I'm tempted to go to the question and answer box and ask another question, but I think I'm going to move us on in the last few minutes, because one of the things that I'd quite like to ask you all before we do our final poll is, based on the theme this year of International Women's Day and what you choose to challenge, and leading on from what we've just said about some of the positives that have come out of the last year, what do you think that as a result of how it's been for us, would you want to choose to challenge moving forwards? So perhaps I can just work back through you all backwards, if you like, and start with you, Marianne. That doesn't give you many minutes to think about it, I'm afraid, but is there anything you particularly would choose to challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I choose to challenge the idea that the economy is just about goods and services bought and sold in the marketplace, and is the kind of public world. You know, we need to recognise that the economy is also what goes on in the home. It's about cooking, it's about cleaning, it's about caring for other people. And there are, you know, at the heart of a lot of women's economic inequality is inequality in the domestic sphere and inequality in unpaid care. And we will not resolve the pay gap, we will not resolve women in public life, we will not resolve those issues until we resolve the issue of who's doing most of the cooking and the cleaning and the wiping of bottoms. So that's that.
That was very neat and tidy of you, Marianne, because I think that was actually one of the other questions in the Q&A box. I don't know whether you clocked that, but it was very much about women being forced back into the domestic sphere. So you've kind of touched on that one. I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to say in response to that question. Feel free if you'd like to.
Let me have, is this domesticated women further and pushed women back into?
Yes,
I think there is a real risk of that, and we've certainly seen it. I mean, the UN has talked about this, PricewaterhouseCoopers has talked about this, you know, women have left the labour market around the world in significantly larger numbers than men, and it's difficult to get back. You know, there are things we can do about that, and one of the big things is around leave policy. If you look at those countries where men share care more evenly, I mean, there's nowhere where it's shared exactly equally. They tend to be countries where men have taken longer periods of leave when a child is born. That's often when patterns of caring get fixed. And so we actually need leave policy that really encourages and pushes men to take significant periods, several months of leave on their own, looking after children when they are, you know, under a year old, because that sets a pattern for, you know, who's responsible for looking after children. It breaks this idea that kind of mothers are the experts and fathers are the bumbling apprentice. And so I think, yeah, leave policy is really, really significant.
Thank you for explaining that a little bit more. That was really very helpful. And Mandu, can I come to you in terms of what you would choose to challenge?
Oh, there's so many things, but I do feel like talking about economics. I choose to challenge the assumption that we are going to be fed, and they've already started to feed it to us, that austerity, the sequel, is the way out of the economic crisis that we found ourselves in. I challenge that with everything I've got, because we saw the damage it's done. And I don't believe that it's what this country needs in order to rebuild and create a resilient, prosperous economy and community for all of us. I want to challenge something else. I also challenge this idea that we have to accept the status quo, as stubborn as it may be. We don't have to accept it. I'm not saying it's easy to take it on and challenge it, but half the battle is believing that it's worth it and that it's possible. And so I absolutely challenge that what is unfolding is inevitable. It doesn't need to be, but it is up to us to, rise up and start building towards toppling it. And so let's do that.
Thank you. And Harriet?
I would choose to challenge probably the lack of female representation in Parliament. I think that we're not going to see change unless we see better representation of women in decision-making spaces. And in the UK especially, we've made very little progress in the last 20 years to achieve sort of meaningful progress on that. And I think that a key piece of the puzzle here is making the political sphere a more friendly and accepting place of women, and I think that includes calling out sexist media coverage of politicians and women. So I think that, yeah, that's one thing that we can do actively and make it known that we're not okay with that.
Thank you, Harriet. And Anita, can I come to you?
So yeah, I choose to challenge the no recourse to public funds rule. So I'm going to focus on migrant women. So no recourse to public funds means that they don't have access to certain benefits. If they're experiencing domestic abuse, there's a stark choice of domestic abuse or destitution or deportation. They've been left out of the domestic abuse bill, and we've got to protect all women without discrimination. There's a firewall that's needed to protect women who report domestic abuse, because they're in fear that they're going to be reported to the Home Office. And we also need to abolish the no recourse to public funds rule. And in this pandemic, other countries have done it, we haven't. And it's meaning that women aren't seeking healthcare because they fear it's going to cost them money or they're going to be deported. So yeah, I choose to challenge that, and you can check out Step Up Migrant Women as a campaign if you wanted to choose to challenge it yourselves.
And
thank you, Anita.
Can I just add something to what Anita said? I hope you don't mind. It is one of the things we're doing to challenge that exact point is pushing for London and cities across the UK to declare themselves as sanctuary cities, where they defy the government's, where you have a mayor in place who has the power to defy the government's stance on this, like they've done in the USA. We're not making this stuff, plucking it out of the air. It can be done. And so if cities can do that and lead the way, it will provide the starting point for migrant women who are in the situation you describe, Anita, to have some place where they can be treated equally and as the human beings that they are, to get the services and support that they need. So there's your campaign, which is absolutely brilliant, and then there's targeted focus on mayors who wield power but don't use it to serve women nearly enough.
Thank you, Anita and Mandu, for raising this really important point, and I'm glad we found time to talk about that a little bit this afternoon. So we're about to close. Before we do, we're going to just run one last poll for you all, and it is off the back of the last little discussion that we've had. We're just going to ask you now what it is that you would like to take forward. So if it's okay just to run that last poll before we close, if you can bear with us for a minute or two longer, that would be very welcome. Thank you. So the last poll is, what action might you take following this panel? And you can choose any of these options, so don't feel obliged just to choose one. Choose as many as you like, and then we can quickly take a look at the results. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll shortly. So if anybody wants to make any last quick vote. And I'm sharing the results. Okay, so donate to a food bank and reach out to a friend seem to be the most popular options, but it's good also to see that there are some high votes for choosing to challenge on social media, despite what we've all had to say this morning about Twitter, and also writing to our local MPs. So thank you for that, and I hope you do feel able to follow through with some of those actions. So it just now remains for me to thank all of you today for joining us for the impact of COVID-19 on women panel event with Brighton Women's Centre and hosted by Brighton Dome, and to thank Brighton Dome for supporting us today for this event. I'd particularly like to thank all of my panelists for their time on this Saturday to come along and join the conversation. Really appreciated having you all here, and it's been fantastic to have your input, so thank you so much for that. And finally, I would just like to thank my amazing group of BWC volunteers led by Rachel Beck, who have yet again this year done a fantastic job of making sure that we have our presence for International Women's Day. I'm not going to mention all of you, but you know who you are. There's far too many to mention at this point, but thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your sunny Saturday. Bye-bye.
Right.